If you are a devoted intellectual atheist, you've probably already seen the YouTube short where Alex O'Connor is investigating or interviewing Richard Dawkins and his opinion. What a train wreck Richard Dawkins makes of everything with his last comment. Very last thing he says undermines the entire interview. Let me walk you through it. First of all, Alex O'Connor asked, he said, how do we decide what is good? So he's, asking Richard Dawkins this existential question. But something that's very interesting is from the materialistic standpoint, it's not us deciding what is good. If we're just matter and molecules, don't we kind of discover what is good? So you go out and taste fruit berries, and that one's good, that one's good, that one kills people. So don't eat the bad fruit berries. But here you see the relativism creeping into the idea that human beings somehow have transcended and become super enlightened, and we now get to decide what is good instead of just discovering what is good. And I would just say there's a problem there, because human beings aren't really good at discovering what is good or even deciding what is good because of delayed consequences. So many times we'll make a decision that looks good now and then totally falls apart later, such as socialism and communism. It really looks good up front. Everybody's got everything equal and in common until you find out it undermines the human spirit, and in so doing, it just creates devastation and poverty. So without the clear guidance of a higher power, we don't really know what good is, but here they are. These two philosophical intellectuals are trying to reason it out. And Dawkins responds with a very intriguing statement. He says, I think that is genuinely a difficult question. No, it isn't. Every person on planet Earth knows the difference between good and evil. It's pretty quick to be able to decide the difference between good and evil. We have this figured out quickly. Think about it. Most people are religious, and they automatically know there's a difference between good and evil. I suspect that most people aren't religious, kind of feel, their conscience and kind of know the difference between good and evil. But let's even bring in the atheist for a second. Do you think an atheist doesn't clearly know what they think is good and evil for their personal life? Even Matt Dillahunty quickly says, hey, if we can all agree on the goodness of well-being, see, that's easy, right? And so when Dawkins says something like, well, that's a difficult question, that's a hard question to investigate, it's not. It's not at all. What's hard is when you try to kick out values, transcendent ideas, and commit to a materialistic position, then it is very hard to make sense of life, and it actually doesn't work. So Dawkins further said, I think that is genuinely a difficult question. Sam Harris goes rather far when he says, no, we can actually define what is good and bad, and suffering is bad. So he's talking about Sam Harris's objective position on what suffering is. And Dawkins further says, well, and he tries to throw this relative slant in there. He says, it's bad, suffering is bad for him. But see, Dawkins knows that this position doesn't actually work. It falls apart. And he mentions that later, because suffering is not always bad. Exercise, dieting, and self-control is suffering, but it brings about goodness. And so you can't go with pain equals bad, good feelings equals good, because that doesn't quite fit and work. Dawkins knows this because he has debated with Christians. So he says, and agreeing with this Sam Harrison, he says, I think certainly at a common sense level, I would like to go along with that. Did you hear that? A few weeks ago, I mentioned something about most people sense that there is a God. And as soon as I said most people, ad populum fallacy. You are completely wrong because you used a logically wrong argument. I understand the point of ad populums. It doesn't mean that it's true, but a lot of times it points to it being true. But what is the difference between a theist using that and then Dawkins outright saying common sense? It's across the board. I'm appealing to vast majorities. I wonder why atheists and maybe agnostics are not fair on this, and call him out on this and go, hey, you can't just appeal to common sense. The problem is we know what he's talking about, that there is a common sense amongst us. And I'd say the main difference here between Christians and Dawkins is we're not just appealing when it fits our position, we're appealing to the ad populum concept when it matches reality. But Dawkins here, when he says, I'm appealing to common sense, and later he talks about aesthetic values, and in another video where he's kind of debating with Ian Hirsi-Elise, when he's kind of going back and forth with them, he's mentioning all these levels of thought. So he believes in common sense, he believes in the aesthetics, he believes in something like softening or the emotions or whatnot. And I think all of this is to try to point out that, we don't want to think in these inferior ways, and there's times you might be caught in that, but let's really hang on to logic as if it is the perfect reasoning. But there's some problems with that any atheist should really share as an atheist high priest. It's that logic is built off of assumptions. You get back to these previous assumptions, these presuppositions, these base assertions, etc. We all have to start with some sort of guessing framework. And from that, your logic just could absolutely be wrong. And what about that all logic, I don't care how good and logical you are, you're always going to be working with incomplete data. So your logic could be flawed just because it has an incomplete amount of data. Or have all the mysteries and contradictions of logic been solved? No, they have not been. And so then you also have all logical fallacies been categorized. If he's trying to get us, like, I don't, judge Christianity on this thought, or I'm not working my way through philosophy on these lower reasoning levels, I'm working through with, logic or some kind of perfect thought system, is he willing to consider that we might even discover more logical fallacies as we go and label them and like, oh, we thought this was okay, but now as we really ponder it, we're like, that's a flaw in and of itself. I don't think we found them all. Further, what about counterintuitive realities where after you understand something, it then makes sense because you have the advanced reasoning, but before it is actually counterintuitive. So take, for instance, riding a motorcycle. There's something called countersteering. If you want to go left, you push forward on the left handlebar, pushing the motorcycle the right direction, just slightly, don't do it fast, and you will dip immediately to the left. But that is counterintuitive. It is counter to what you would logically think. It would be counter to common sense. And it's only until you have more information, all the information, all of the experience, that you could actually make this. And so if we're trying to get into the transcendent realms of figuring out what truth and logic is on our own, I hope you see how futile of an attempt this is, because we're lacking so many pieces of information. How do you think we're going to put it all together? But Dawkins further goes, but it is possible for some philosopher to come along and say, no, I think suffering is good. You can't totally argue against it. Yeah, okay. I just think it is a horrible thing to say. Now, what is he doing here? He is stating that from his viewpoint of materialism, if somebody really wants to come along and push for negativity and suffering is good, you can't really fight it, even though you should know better. But why is he wanting to do that? It's because it's because of the restraint mechanism here. Dawkins does not want to be under the moral code. He actually knows there's a right and wrong, and I'll explain that. I can prove that here in a second. He actually knows there's a right and wrong, but he doesn't want to be his freedoms to be impinged by that. And so he wants to give everybody freedom. But the problem is when you give people freedom and you have to allow that some people are wicked and backwards, that can come back to haunt you. So you kind of have to restrain people. But here when he says, I just think it's a horrible thing to say. I think it is horrible for you to think that suffering is good. He's just making an assertion. He's just making a philosophical assertion at this point. Dawkins also said, I think most people would agree with this, that this is a horrible thing to say. Back to the ad populum fallacy. Like, why does he get away with that for logic and reasoning? Why are all the intellectual atheists out there not just chewing this up and going, you don't just get to say something and claim it's the case. And all we see on the theist side of things is we see people just parroting, pop, 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 just parroting whatever these guys say, even when they use the exact fallacies that you use to tear Christianity apart with, or you think you tear it apart. So he says, so Alex O'Connor catches him on this, and he says, but then this slightly rings of when people say, yes, you can come along and say there is no God, but I think that is a fairly horrible thing to say. And Dawkins, knowing he caught, was like, yes, you got me. Christians can say that it's a horrible thing that we say there's no God. Yeah, I get it. They have their aesthetic side of the fence. We've got our aesthetic side of the fence. How do we figure this out? He said, well, it's an aesthetic thing. I don't think it's a horrible thing to say there's no God. I'm just going to assert it. I'm just going to make it so. Now, Dawkins is being asked about the deepest part of his philosophy that doesn't work because it's really complicated and you can't really totally figure out what right and wrong is. Like, Sam Harris goes too far. I'd like to agree with him, but you can't totally agree with him. And I don't really have quite an answer for this. But I'm just going to assert aesthetically that this is bad and horrible. I just get to make an opinion statement. And people will just accept this, but they won't accept that the Bible just makes opinion statements, except they're not opinions, they're truth. The Bible says it's true, and then people are like, how do you know the Bible's true? And that's because the Bible says it's true. But Dawkins is doing the very same thing. Dawkins is saying, well, I don't think that's the case because I don't think that's the case, and I'm just going to make that stand. How is that any different from the scriptures? If you're getting into circular reasoning on either side of the fence, then what you need to look into is which side of the fence closely aligns with reality. I'm going to point how Dawkins doesn't here in a second. Dawkins goes on to me, I don't actually have a comeback to some sadists who come along and say, I think suffering is wonderful. Well, why doesn't Dawkins have a response to these sadists? Because he's trying to make an allowance that there is nothing transcendent, but common sense-wise, he can see that something is wrong, but he doesn't want to be restrained in his freedom to make his own choices. That's actually what is underneath this. So Alex goes, so what if someone is using some sadistic, and I couldn't quite hear this, I don't know if it was bent, or end, but there's something within the person, okay? So what if someone is using some sadistic, I'm just going to say bend, that they have in order to justify some religious morality? They're using some devious method to justify morality. How are you, and he's talking to Dawkins, how are you going to communicate that person that they're doing is wrong? Now, I want you to understand here, Dawkins has actually come out and stated he wants to live in a Christian culture. Now, he would prefer it to be an all-atheist culture, but I don't think he's checked on the beginnings of liberal Missouri and how that was catastrophic. But he claims he wants to live in an atheist society first, but Christianity would be far better than anything else. And it's probably because he wouldn't have any freedom, no freedom of speech. He wouldn't have prosperity. He wouldn't have some of the comforts of life, etc. And the other question is, why does he not have any kind of restraint for evil? If we're trying to figure out what good is, we need to be able to restrain evil in others. He's like, I really don't have a response for people that, these sadists, they're saying evil is good. I don't have a response for that. I don't have a way to restrain that. Because he's committed to a bad position when everybody else with common sense would know better. Dawkins further says, and this is his out, I think such a person would be quite rare. I think I'd rather devote my attention to decent people. And this is the undermining statement of his career. To say, I think such a person would be quite rare. Well, then, Dawkins, why in the world have you spent years and years and years trying to destroy the church or any other religion? Great. I hope you have destroyed some other religions, but you're never going to destroy Christianity. That's been tried in the past. But why do you spend all this time trying to destroy it if the really sadistic, bad, motivated people in it are rare? And then here's what he really gives away. He said, that is rare, those types that you're talking about. Like you're talking about, for all practical purposes, you're talking about true evil here, that's hiding behind religion. I think those people are rare. Just in stating that, he's stating that most of religion then would be okay or good. If there's no good and evil, then who cares if there's religion or not? But he says that the truly evil people are rare, so that would, by default, means most of religion is okay and good, which is not good for his positional standing to begin with. But then he says, I'd rather spend my time on decent people. He has just flat out made a judgment statement about right and wrong, which shows that he can quickly assess between right and wrong. At the very beginning, Alex O'Connor said, how do we determine what is good? And if Dawkins would have been utterly truthful, what he would have said is like, that's easy. We know the difference between good and evil, and, we should abide by that. But he doesn't want to be constrained by somebody else's value system. So he's, it's really, really complicated. But when he's backed into a corner that needs addressing, he just makes a value statement which shows that he knows the difference between good and evil, right and wrong from the very beginning, just like you and I do, and we're all going to be judged along these lines.